Let's do it. You ready? Arizona.
Yeah, you know it, boys. You know it. Welcome to a Saturday night right here in Phoenix, Arizona.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Arizona.FYI, a history, culture, and current events podcast wherein we tell tales about the most interesting, wildest, and youngest of the contiguous United States. My name is Mark, and at various points in this podcast's future, I'll be joined by Dan, Karen, and for interviews by many other colorful characters from across Arizona. Arizona has long had a reputation as the last bastion of the Wild West. A rough and tumble state that's had unprecedented growing pains, but has always had a forward-looking and optimistic, if sometimes misguided, vision of its own future. Arizona's history is both urban and remote, modern and antique, gruesome and gritty as well as upbeat and funny. I hope you'll check out a few of our episodes and stick around to learn more about our state with us. Today we'll be discussing an event that Wikipedia gives only a single sentence: Sheriff Carl Hayden and the Beardless Boy Bandits. Just a note. In this episode and in future episodes, we'll probably be using Indian as a convenient and historically used label for the native peoples referred to in these stories, unless we can positively identify the specific tribe or communities that are involved. Most of the peoples that would have taken part in this story would have been part of the Gila River Indian community, which, while historically composed of Acapella Otham, aka Pima, also includes refugee Peeposh or Maricopa and Yuman peoples from Sacaton to Maricopa. If you have insight into this or any topic that comes up in this episode, please feel free to join the discussion at Arizona.FYI/1. In early May of 1910, train robberies were something that happened back in the old days, to your father in the Old West. Those days were decidedly over, and this was the dawn of the New West. It would only be 2 years until the Titanic sinks. Driving an automobile was the ultimate status symbol. Short movies were being shown during variety performances in large theaters packed with bankers and grocers and townspeople. Electric streetcars roamed the avenues of Phoenix and Tucson, shuttling post-Victorian ladies and gentlemen about their business. Arizona's eyes were fixed on a bright agricultural future in the Salt River Valley and the prospect of putting her lawless cowboy past behind her. This here tale is the story of two boys from Oklahoma who took their fortunes into their own hands and headed west to be cowboys, and how on one fateful morning they ended up on the wrong side of a real-life game of cops and robbers that played out across the southern Arizona desert. Ernest and Oscar Woodson had come out west to find their fortunes as cattlemen, and for a time they were successful. Working all day as cowboys was mighty thirsty work, and the big city provided tempting entertainments for young men with full pockets in the form of vaudeville shows. Who could resist the advertisements in the Arizona Republic newspaper? There will be a show at the Goodwin Opera House this evening, consisting of various vaudeville stunts by the Seymour twins and moving pictures and illustrated songs. One of the more famous of these moving pictures presented at the theaters was none other than The Great Train Robbery from 1903. Now, I don't know if these boys saw this movie here in Phoenix or back home in Oklahoma, or even at all, but what happens next is more in common with fiction than any account of the truth. And you know what they say, you just can't make this stuff up. On the morning of Tuesday, the 11th of May, 1910, after withdrawing the entirety of their savings from the bank the day before, the brothers head to the illustrious Cowboy Corral, an auction and consignment house for cattle, horses, and other livestock, at 5 Points. This was the name of the neighborhood at the intersection where Grand Avenue begins to head northwest, at 7th Avenue and Van Buren, just west of downtown. With the plausible story of visiting the Bartlett Herd Land and Cattle Company out east, our boys rent 2 horses from proprietor A.J. Fitzhugh. From there, they pick up the Maricopa and Phoenix Railway line, the M&P, or the Arizona Eastern as it was known to the federal government, unbeknownst to the people of Phoenix, was a spur railroad that brought passengers from Phoenix down through Tempe, known as Hayden's Ferry until only a decade before this story, to the Union Pacific Railway Station at the town of Maricopa. When the boys reach the Gila River crossing just south of Sacaton Station, they pick out a perfect spot to stash their mounts during the next day's exploits, just as in the movie The Great Train Robbery. They then complete the trip to Maricopa and head back to Phoenix, arriving to return their horses at the Cowboy Corral by nightfall. The next morning, after enjoying a fine breakfast at the then-famous Garden City Chinese restaurant, just about where Cityscape is today, the boys pay another visit to Mr. Fitzhugh and the Cowboy Corral. They request 2 horses, but not the same they had the day before. Because as you might guess, you want fresh horses when you're running from the law down in Mexico. Being unable to accommodate this request, they were given the same black and bay horses from the day previous and sent on their way. This would ultimately be a major factor of their undoing. Once more, they pass through Tempe and make their way south along the Maricopa and Phoenix Railway. This time they stash the horses in the Gila River bottom and make their way to Maricopa on foot, a distance of about 7 miles, arriving in time for the evening train back towards Phoenix. They board the train with around 16 other passengers and wait for it to pull out of the station. Now this here train is just a short spur line, but it connects to the mighty Union Pacific, which brought freight and passengers from back east to Tucson and Maricopa, and out to Gila Bend and on to Los Angeles. It was also half of the best way to get from Tucson to Phoenix. It was just this journey, on that fateful evening, that Attorney General Wright of the territory of Arizona was traveling with his acquaintance, one Deputy Sheriff Sturgis of Gila County, along with his colleague deputy and their 2 prisoners. All of the above were seated comfortably in the smoking car towards the front of the train, where they were enjoying cigars and conversation. Shortly after the train began moving, the boys stood and shuffled to the rear of the passenger car to begin their robbery. Oscar, the younger of the 2, pulled 2 rented .45 caliber pistols from beneath his jacket, and with all the force of personality you could expect from a 17-year-old boy, he meekly entreated for the passengers to hold up their hands. Thinking these boys were joking, the passengers paid little attention. Ernest ordered the pocketbook from the first passenger, and finding the incredulous man too slow in retrieving it, brought the pistol butt squarely down upon his head. At the sight of the resulting spurt of blood, the remaining passengers quickly prepared their belongings for collection. The train's news agent, basically a fruit and newspaper salesman who worked for the M&P Railway, heard the meek, "Hold up your hands," at the back of the car, and seeing the writing on the wall, did as the boy asked. He surreptitiously raised his hands, pocketbook included, to the ceiling. But being a clever railway employee and versed in the stories of robberies past, he had the idea to quickly and quietly flip his pocketbook, containing $75, almost $1,800 in today's money, out the window. Later, when the robbers cleaned him of his valuables, they only found $4.50, which is still almost $100 today. The pocketbook was retrieved the next day by the brakeman. Coming to the middle door between the passenger and smoking car, they met with Conductor Woodcock making his initial rounds through the train cars, having just left the sheriffs and their prisoners. Woodcock, thinking these boys with pistols must be but a few more deputy sheriffs playing a joke, smiled as he brought his arms skyward in mock surprise. Ernest began to relieve him of his valuables. Behind the conductor in the smoking car, Deputy Sturgis looked on with a smile, enjoying the practical joke that this boy was playing. It wasn't until a pistol found its way to Deputy Sturgis's face that he realized they were serious. Sturgis slowly reached for the revolver in his coat, but at a motion from the Attorney General thought better of it. Later they would say that drawing upon these boys would certainly cause a bloodbath in the cramped quarters. Sturgis allowed the boys to relieve him of his revolver and his pocketbook, but kept his second gun concealed. In all, he'd give up $65 of the budget afforded for transporting his prisoners, as well as a few of his own gold pieces. The Attorney General gave up only $9, and the prisoners were forced to turn out their pockets with predictable results. The boys then returned to the passenger compartment while covering the door to the rear car. Conductor Woodcock smiled as the boys moved back past, because he knew the brakeman Sharp was soon to arrive, on his rounds lighting the lamps for the evening. Sure enough, the brakeman threw open the door and was suddenly face to face with Oscar and his twin .45s, which were shaken like a leaf as the boy bandit tried to look tough. "Now, son, steady your hands. I don't want to get shot by a nervous man," exclaimed the brakeman. Oscar motioned with his guns. "Hold up your hands, and while you're at it, signal the engineer to stop this train." Brakeman Sharp put his hands up in the air and tugged twice on the cable that ran from the front of the train to the back. Somehow, the boys knew the signals and caught on to his ruse. "Two's for the next station, old man. We want to stop the train now." Before the brakeman could react, one of the passengers began to pull on the cable excitedly. Up in the engineer's cabin, the bell rang furiously, and the engineer brought the train to a halt. The boys jumped from the train, and pointing a revolver at the engineer, yelled that he need not keep the train stopped on their account. One of the 2 deputies opened fire, emptying his revolver. As the boys retreated to the river bottom, they returned 3 shots. When the train made it to the next station, a telegram was sent back to Maricopa, where the Union Pacific superintendent immediately spent the night wiring all points, coordinating the manhunt. For the next few hours, Union Pacific Rail Superintendent Scott burned wires to Gila Bend out west, Silver Bell Mine near Globe to the east, and up to Phoenix, and even to Mexico via Tucson. Now here's where we pick up with the main cop in this game of cops and robbers, Maricopa County Sheriff Carl T. Hayden. Now if you think that name sounds familiar, you'd be right. You might know him as 2-time second in line for the presidency of the United States, as interim House Speaker in the United States Congress. You might have heard his reputation for quiet leadership and bipartisan compromise, leading to his nickname, the third senator from every state. You might know him for his record as the longest-serving member of Congress until Strom Thurmond. Or, and let's be honest here, you might just remember driving on Hayden Road in Scottsdale on your way to see the movie Spare Parts, which tells the story of 4 Carl Hayden High School students who beat MIT in a robot building competition. Needless to say, Mr. Hayden was a mighty important man to Arizona and the nation, and he's mighty important to the fate of our 2 boys, Ernest and Oscar. Upon receiving the telegram from Maricopa, Hayden organized his posse, loading himself, his deputy, and their horses on a special livestock car on the M&P train, and headed south in the early morning hours. So now we've got Deputy Sturgis of Gila County and his colleague from the smoking car, who had immediately set out from Sacaton Station to chase the boys from their camp following their trail southeast, towards Casa Grande. Sheriff Nelson of Pima County decided to shirk an important court date in the morning and was heading north from Tucson. Pinal County's posse was riding hard down the hill from Silver Bell towards Casa Grande. Meanwhile, the Gila County Sheriff's posse began searching for the campsite after having left Maricopa going north, coming across it at first light. They sent word via Indian messenger to Sacaton Station, which was wired to Maricopa where Carl Hayden's posse had arrived. Hayden had continued to Casa Grande and rode north to Sacaton to enlist the help of the Indian villages, promising $100, $2,400 today, to anyone who materially aided in the capture of the bandits, and instructing them to arrest every white man they encountered. Hayden's offer was so attractive it nearly ended up putting him in chains later that morning. A few hours later, as he and Superintendent Scott were searching a grove of mesquite trees between Sacaton Indian Agency and Casa Grande, a large Indian policeman approached the pair. Scott turned to Hayden and said, "Carl, I see right now where you and I get run in. In about 2 minutes, we'll be disarmed, strapped on the back of a horse, and dragged off to Sacaton." Fortunately, it turned out the Indian policeman was known to Scott, and the incident turned into nothing more than a funny sideline in the morning paper. Hayden's $100 offer elicited a great deal of activity around Casa Grande and led to the discovery of the tracks of 2 shod horses heading southwest about 3 miles outside of town by Indian trackers. When asked how they knew these were the tracks of the fugitives, the trackers replied, "Indian horses don't have shoes." Hayden wired his posse at Maricopa and instructed them to follow the tracks with the Indian trailers in tow. The sheriff promised he'd catch the posse up with relief later in the day and contacted hotel owner McCarthy in the town of Maricopa for the use of his automobile. McCarthy had been the butt of a whimsical newspaper article only a few months previous, which lampooned his Keeping Up with the Joneses feud with the owner of the only other hotel in Maricopa. In the article, it was established that McCarthy was the most reckless driver in all the territory, and this is exactly what attracted Hayden's attention. McCarthy was all too happy to oblige, and he and Sheriff Hayden loaded his car up with hay, food, and water, and, quote, flew out of Maricopa Station, tearing down all obstacles in their way. Now, I've run into some debate on the make of the car. Most accounts of this story that you'll find in modern media state that it was an Apperson Jackrabbit. I think this comes from a letter that Carl Hayden himself drafted in 1967 when he was 90 years old, 5 decades after the chase. All the contemporary accounts I've found in newspapers describing the ordeal, along with eyewitness accounts in the article that's specifically about the day McCarthy bought the car, as well as the events surrounding his race with another hotel owner, label it as a Stoddard Dayton. All we really need to know about this is that it was a 1910 4-seater open car, little different than a horse trailer, the kind that has wooden wheels and goes awooga and putt putt putt. Most definitely, this car wasn't ready to tear across the Arizona desert in the middle of the day in late May. It overheated several times, sending McCarthy under the hood with dipstick and thermometer. As one news article put it, quote, "One thing in which there seemed no doubt was that but for the McCarthy machine and the McCarthy grit, the robbers would have escaped. When the machine was working well, he drove like a very devil. When there was anything wrong, he was over it, under it, and everywhere about it, working like the Furies, while great drops of perspiration poured off him. Never a word of complaint or worry came from him." Knowing the car wouldn't make it across the arroyos and the washes of the open desert, they decided to stick to the Veckel Mine Road. The Veckel Mine was a sizable camp which still bears that name, though the buildings are long abandoned, and which lies directly south and a little west of Maricopa. Hayden, McCarthy, and U.S. Customs Inspector Cronin finally reached Hayden's posse about 10 miles from the Veckle, about 25 miles south of Maricopa at this point, and offloaded the supplies that they had brought. They then decided to push on to Veckle since there wasn't any wire communication with the camp, and they couldn't warn them about the fugitives. Oscar and Ernest, being from Oklahoma and not having grown up here, seriously underestimated the importance of water in the desert. They had brought only 4 beer bottles, which they had refilled at a well in one of the Indian communities early that morning. They were desperate for water, and their horses were exhausted, and thus they decided to rest in a stand of Palo Verde trees near the Veckle Road to avoid the hottest part of the day. The decision by the cowboy corral operator, Mr. Fitzhugh, to give the boys the same horses they had the day before, combined with the mistreatment by the greenhorn fugitives, put the horses in a bad way, and the boys were now stranded until the horses could recover. Around 2 p.m., they hear the put-put-put of an approaching automobile. Thinking it must be a wealthy mine owner visiting his claim, Oscar decides to flag down the driver and ask for water. Not wanting to appear armed if it was a normal citizen, and not wanting to fight if it was the law, he had hidden his gun in his saddlebag. Oscar walked out, and the auto stopped. He called out, "Y'all have any water?" which was answered with, "Hands up, son." He was covered by all 3 of the occupants of the vehicle. Ernest heard this through the trees, and his ego decided he should make a show of it, so he came out with his rifle up. But thanks to the restraint of the officers, he had the luxury to think better of it, and dropped his weapon when covered. The boys were cuffed and loaded into the car, and after retracing the path, the posse was instructed to collect the horses and loot. Hayden headed back to Casa Grande with his prisoners in the auto, but didn't make it that far. It finally gave up the ghost, and they were stranded until they could catch one of the Indian trailers for a ride back to the train station. When they arrived back in Phoenix, Hayden actively ducked the looky-loos at the station and disembarked early, sneaking his prisoners in the back way. He later placed all credit for organizing the chase on Superintendent Scott, for catching the bandits on McCarthy's driving, and U.S. Customs Inspector Cronin's intimidating presence, and the Indian community for their support and tracking abilities. Sheriff Hayden's treatment of the whole situation, which was characterized by restraint, quiet leadership, and avoidance of the spotlight, became a hallmark of his long and storied career in Congress, which he gained in part by parlaying the publicity foisted upon him by the nationally famous Beardless Bandits chase. Ultimately, the boys were found with a little over $75, which would have the purchasing power of approximately $1,800 now. They had originally stolen $265 from the passengers, which is over $6,400 of value today, but had missed most of it hidden in other pockets or in other compartments, and had dropped most of it in their initial camp due to their haste. They were arraigned on embezzling the horses from the corral in a local court, but were extradited by the federal government and eventually served 3.5 years of a 10-year term in Leavenworth, Kansas. All right. So Karen's had to listen to the story so far. And Karen, this is Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen. Nice to meet you.
Karen's had a chance to listen to the story. Did anything stand out that you wanted to talk about, or any questions about it?
I thought it was just really interesting how these boys changed so many lives, I guess, in one day without really actually doing anything. Exactly. Like the last probable train robbery.
Yep. Basically the last train robbery in the Old West for 16 years from the last train robbery to this current one.
So I just love the fact that they had the train, they had horses, they had an automobile, and they literally covered a really small amount of area with every mode of transportation that was available to them in Arizona at the time.
Yeah, the chase itself was about 80 miles. So they covered 80 miles. Probably 15 of that on a train and 65 of that by horse.
That's phenomenal. Not being a horse person, not really growing up with horses, and having driven in that area now and realizing it's a long way sitting in a modern day car.
Yeah.
But doing that on horseback
in the middle of the day, in May, in the Arizona desert,
on a with no real preparation,
no water, no know-how, nothing. These kids are straight out of Oklahoma. They don't know anything about the desert. They decide to plan out meticulously the robbery, plan out meticulously how they're going to escape. They knew from seeing the movie, The Great Train Robbery, they knew what they needed to do. They needed where to put the horses, how to pull off the robbery, what to say, how to do all this stuff. What they didn't realize was, the Great Train Robbery was a movie, and what comes after the robbery is the hard part, especially when you're trying to go to Mexico from Phoenix, which is, it's 80 to 100 miles to the border. It's another 120 miles to Port Lobos, which is where they were trying to end up in Mexico. So even once they got to Mexico and once they crossed that border, they still would have had to run double that distance.
And the fact that they did the trial the day before and then did it again.
With the same horses.
With the same horses and only covered a very small stretch and had no idea what lay ahead of them.
Yeah.
That part just totally blows my mind.
So I think that they knew Port Lobos from the newspapers. In my research for this, I found several advertisements leading up to the week of the chase and a couple of weeks after. It seemed like there was like a land scam going on with Port Lobos. Port Lobos currently is a very tiny town. It's maybe 40 houses on this little point of land that's in the Gulf of Baja. It's on the western side or the eastern side of the Baja Gulf. Mm-hmm. What is that called?
I have to look.
Gulf of Cortez.
I'm embarrassed that I don't know.
Yeah. That's where Rocky Point is.
Gulf of California.
The Gulf of California. So we're going to call that the Baja Gulf or whatever. So anyway, Port Lobos is a little tiny point of land between Puerto Penasco or Rocky Point and the one that's south of there that's a little bit larger known. Basically, this is a land scam. People are trying to get people to move there and buy cheap land and then raise money for a railway that'll go back towards Tucson and Phoenix. So in the papers leading up to it, there's full page advertisements in the Arizona Republic. Like, come to Puerto Lobos and buy a small piece of land, 20 acres for $300. And then immediately start growing citrus and you'll be fine. We're going to create a railway and all this. So I think that they had seen those advertisements. They thought, if we can get a little seed money here, we can go down there to Port Lobos. We can roll the seed money into a land claim. We can take, what other money we have, start a business down there. We'll be set like kings once the railway opens to Tucson, and we'll be good to go forever. So I think that's kind of what they had in mind. And I'm reading nothing into this other than the fact that they said that they were going to Port Lobos, and there was nothing in Port Lobos except for this land scam.
That's amazing. Because I didn't read the newspapers as much as you did. I had them read to me as you were doing the research. And I didn't I didn't see the... Ad
nauseum, I'm sure.
But no, it was actually really interesting. Just looking at the world 100 years ago. I mean, it was only 106 years ago that this happened.
Not that long. And
no,
my dad was born before the sheriff died,
Mm-hmm.
And
when you even bring up a good point, like to put it into perspective of it's still 2 years before the Titanic sank. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're in the rough and tumble West, even though there are little hints and glimmers of the future, that like the cars and the fact that there were only two types of cars.
Well, there were several types of cars, but the ones that were in the story, there's another one. So actually, let's get into that. So McCarthy's automobile was actually a famous thing, and the only reason that Sheriff Hayden knew about McCarthy's automobile was because there was a newspaper article about it 2 months before this chase. So I assume that Hayden or somebody that was associated with him in the posse knew about the automobile and thought, hey, that's a great idea. We should go get that auto and we should try and use it in this chase, because that had never been done in Arizona before. Mm-hmm. I think it had been done in the country or it had been done somewhere else before. But this is the first time in Arizona where an automobile was used in a chase after fugitives. So
not the last time, but the first time.
Yep. So I'm going to read a thing here. This is all about McCarthy's auto. So this is where I get the Stoddard Dayton information from. So we know F.J. McCarthy owned the Maricopa Hotel in Maricopa, which is a very small town at this point, all of 18 people, 16 of which worked for either of the two hotels in town, which both served the Union Pacific Railway. The other hotel, the Williams House, is owned by Perry Williams. The two hotels have a spirited rivalry, and the two hoteliers are constantly one-upping each other. One day, about 2 months before the chase, McCarthy decides to take the train to Phoenix and returns with a Stoddard Dayton automobile, which is reported to have cost him between $2,000 and $3,000, somewhere around the value of $60,000 in today's money. When he arrives back, he, in a show of modesty, tells Perry Williams that he's sorry his hotel couldn't pay enough for Williams to afford his own automobile. So not to be outdone, Williams heads to Phoenix the next day and purchases an Overland from the Pratt Gilbert Company. He comes back to Maricopa and proudly shoves it in McCarthy's face. Of course, McCarthy has to pretend to rejoice too, and tells Williams he'd like to take all kinds of trips together. Of course, Perry's Overland didn't compare to the Stoddard Dayton any more than the Williams house compared to the Maricopa Hotel, but it'd do. The next day, McCarthy's Stoddard Dayton is broken down suspiciously. Whether it's the carburetor, spark plugs, or transmission, it's lost to history. Anyhow, the Overland, of course, is perfectly operable, and Perry decided that the best way to ensure a good break-in of the motor was to ride circles around McCarthy's hotel while blowing the horn to make sure the domestic animals kept out of the way. He kept up a constant honking while McCarthy went to the door, shaking his fist and telling Williams that a better road led to a place warmer than Maricopa. But Williams replied he didn't want to try any strange trails that day, and McCarthy could go right on ahead to that warmer place in his Stoddard Dayton. The Stoddard was repaired in a day or two, and the two were said to have been friends, though rivals, in the automobile and hotel businesses since. The article goes on to say that Williams and McCarthy were going to organize a monster automobile meet in Maricopa, and the principal event of which would be a race between the Stoddard and the Overland.
One of the other things I found interesting was the fact that they didn't do more research when they went to rent the horses. Yep. Or they didn't give it, like, even to think ahead to say, hey, are you going to have other horses tomorrow? Or are we going to go and ride this other direction?
They didn't ensure that they would have those horses or different horses the next day.
Or to make or to plan out that maybe go back the next week just to make sure that they had those horses. But I think that goes back to their naiveness of their desert experience. We don't know really how long they'd been in Phoenix.
So they after all of this, at one point, somebody comes to the jail and says, after the news articles come out and say, oh, there's two boys from Oklahoma, Ernest and Oscar Woodson. And this guy comes to the jail and sees Sheriff Hayden and says, I'm from Oklahoma. I think those boys are familiar to me. And so he gets the whole story. And it's basically that when he was in Oklahoma, he owned a farm. He retired to Phoenix. Well, he owned the farm. There was a man named Woodson who had two sons that worked for him on this farm. And he goes to the cell, positively identifies him. As he comes in, the boys are like, hey, what's up? We know you. So obviously there's like, oh, these are the boys. He's saying that the boys are either 21 and 22 instead of 17 and 18, as most people in this story say. I think it's more romantic to believe that they were 17 and 18. They could have been as old as 21, 22. However, the Oklahoma farmer also said that whenever he went to the bar with them, the bartenders would always give them a hard time and would almost refuse to serve them alcohol because they looked young. So I think it's possible that they were young, or they told him that they were older when they were working for him in order to get better wages or whatever. So it speaks to their inexperience as desert dwellers, but it doesn't. They did have some familiarity with horses. They were cowboys, quote unquote. They did work on a ranch back in Oklahoma. So they were familiar with beasts of burden. They were familiar with cows and horses and that sort of thing. So they knew their limits. And you can assume that they knew that they should have gotten new horses, and that's why they asked for them, but they didn't end up with new horses. They didn't ensure that, and they didn't call off their plan when they realized they weren't going to get them. And I think that the desert and not being familiar with the desert really exacerbated that problem.
And that makes sense because me being a transplant to the Phoenix area, when I first moved here, I didn't think I needed to have water with me all the time. I didn't think, I never had air conditioning where I grew up until I was much older. And then you move here and it's such a climate shock. So I can't imagine back then how you would deal with the heat. I mean, they didn't probably have all the modern conveniences that we have today, but
air conditioning wouldn't be invented for another 20 years or so.
That sounds about right.
There's swamp coolers around that time.
But even then, in most places where someone who's just a hand probably doesn't have access to that. And who knows? It's not like you just walk into a convenience store and buy a bottle of water like you do today. I'm like you said, or they had bottles of beer and refilled them with water.
Yep.
So that
so they brought 4 bottles of beer. 4 bottles of beer to run 260 miles to Mexico in the middle of the day. It's going to take them at least 3 days to get there if the horses held out, which of course the horses wouldn't hold out because it's 3 days in the desert. Probably at full gallop because these kids don't know what they're doing.
Or where they're going, probably. Because when you can see mountains, you can see the different landscape pieces, but unless you know exactly if I go towards this mountain, I'm going this direction. Yeah,
they actually, that was remarked on in a lot of the things. The posse said that they were going due south, perfectly south, as if like an engineer had laid the line straight south. And it was because the boys brought a compass with them. They knew that they were going to Mexico. Mexico's south of the States. They just need to go south. They'll be fine. They'll be good to go. What they didn't realize is that compasses have, derivations. There's the magnetic north. There are geographical features in between them and where they're going. So they're going to have to make, they're going to have to go out and around something. They had a compass, but they didn't have a map. So they're just going south. So when they first start out, they didn't realize that there was the deviation between the magnetic north and that sort of thing. They ended up going southeast instead of southwest. So they didn't really know didn't even realize how to read their compass and which way they were supposed to go. So that's why they ended up going from Maricopa towards Casa Grande instead of going from Maricopa south. They're actually going southeast towards Casa Grande.
Interesting.
So yeah, they had a compass. They maybe didn't know how to use it real well. And they also probably didn't know exactly where they're going. They probably had looked at a map and figured out where Port Lobos was, but they probably didn't know the specifics of the way.
To know how, and like you said, how to maneuver with a compass and how to.
I don't think they were ready for any contingency where they ran into a barrier, of which the Mexican desert does have quite a few. There's a lot of mountains. There's a lot of interesting geography between them and there. They're not going to be able to get across that. And
I'm sure they were counting on that at some point they would run into someone who could help them, or that they could borrow, using my air quotes now, help, like getting water from wells or stealing other horses.
Yeah, that's very true. And that shows when they encounter Sheriff Hayden, when he comes along in the automobile, they think that he's a wealthy mine owner or something, that they're going to jump out and just like, hey, you have any water? It's like they would have pulled anybody they could have to help them. And they were not far from Veckel, the mine itself. They probably would have ended up there. And due to the fact that there was no wire communication with Veckel, probably would have been helped out, either given food or fresh horses or something. So.
I'm amazed that they didn't actually try to, and maybe they did in their own way, try to commandeer the car. Because it was how many people at that point? Hayden...
Well, it was Hayden, Customs
McCarthy.
Inspector Cronin, and McCarthy.
So 3.
And possibly another deputy, but it's kind of fuzzy. So it's 3 or 4 men with rifles who are all like...
Trained professionals.
Trained professionals and also grown men. Like, this is a young boy who doesn't even have his weapon on him, and his brother in the bush who does have a weapon, but doesn't end up using it.
Well, that's why I'm wondering, I'm surprised, like, for how... they got away with a robbery. I would think they would have just enough, even though they're wore out, they've ridden across the desert, they've exhausted all of the resources they brought with them, that they didn't have some adrenaline to think, we're going to take this car.
Maybe they did. Maybe if it had actually been a mine owner, maybe Ernest, the older one, would have come out of the brush with a gun. Maybe they would have stolen that car, and maybe they would have gone on. Now, I don't think that would have improved their situation.
Though. No, probably not, because where are you going to get petrol in the middle of the Arizona desert?
Where are you going to get gas? Where are you going to get extra water to keep that thing running? Because it was overheating already. On the way back from arresting these kids, the thing broke down, like, finally. So now it's completely dead. They had to flag down the posse. And they couldn't get the attention of the posse because there's another thing that says, as they were coming back and the car breaks down, Hayden and Cronin stand on top of the car and are shooting guns into the air trying to get the attention of the posse, who's another 5 miles distant. Like, you could see them right over there. Like, oh, there's the posse. Hey, we should shoot in the air and we'll get their attention. They'll come back and they'll help us out and carry us along. That didn't happen. The posse looks back and goes, oh, they're trying to get rid of their extra ammunition or something. Like, oh, they're trying to save weight and whatever. So the posse keeps going. At some point, they finally flag down one of the Indian trailers. The Indian trailer comes along and picks them up and takes the boys into the train station.
And I thought that was an interesting term used, the Indian trailer. Is that more like a tracker?
I think what the Indian trailers are is it's trailer in the sense that here's the main posse, and in tow, that like associated with the posse are several hundred Indians, which are anybody who answered the call. anybody who answered the like, oh, we'll give you $100 if you help us catch these kids. So it's just random people. It's carts being towed by horses. It's guys on horses. It's whatever. So it's just people like trying to come along. And I think trailer just means like they're trailing the deputies.
That makes more sense.
They're not actually like, they're not necessarily having carts, but I think they were actually rescued by a guy with a cart.
I was actually expecting them to be more of a tracker. Like,
well,
because they probably know that desert
in all
better.
of these stories, the Indians are always said to be trackers. There's always this like, oh, they were helped out by Indian trackers, or like the Indians helped them track the people. I think it's just a consequence of being in that culture is just like, oh, we're more in tune with the actual land around us. We can figure out, you know, oh, look, these horses, this track right here has shoes on it. We don't shoe our horses, so obviously this isn't our horses. Hey, dudes, I think these are the guys that you're looking for. So I think that's it. And really what the advantage of getting the Indians involved was, here's 1,000 more eyes.
Keeping a watch for something out of the norm, because...
Yeah, and they would have done that with any community. They would have gone to Phoenix and they would have said, hey, anybody, like, keep a lookout for a trail that's suspicious or whatever. So I think it was more of just those were the people that were following them. You could call them bounty hunters because they were coming after the bounty for the kids.
Which was truly amazing to me. I mean, I guess the idea of wires and Morse code and all of that. Telegrams, just totally... Even, I mean, yes, our technology today, we can get a message across. I can send a message to a friend in Japan like that. But it was so amazing to me that he just got off the train and just sent out the call in every direction and sent wires to everybody that he could think of.
Superintendent Scott spent hours that night.
His hand must have hurt from putting out all of those messages. And
just finding them and sending... messages to all the different posses. And this story involves 4 different posses. It involved the Gila County, the Pima County, the Pinal County, and the Maricopa County posses. All of those were converging on the boys at some point. They were all coming from different directions. It's,
again, amazing to me that they all worked together so easily in such a rough and tumble situation.
Well, and they were working with old information. It was... here's where the boys are. Here's where we think they're going. You guys should end up over here. And even just the coordination with Carl Hayden's posse was he sent his posse to Maricopa. They get to Maricopa. He goes on to Casa Grande and then rides north to Zacatón. These places are probably 20, 30 miles apart. They're not super far apart, but on a horse, that's a couple hours.
That's a long haul.
Yeah. So the coordination between him going out to leaving his posse in Maricopa to then react to when the Gila posse, who had gone north to find the camp. So now his posse is working without his direction because he's in Comunicado because he's going to Zacatón. They're ordered to follow or to wait for the Gila County Sheriff's posse to find the camp and figure out where the kids were going, and then to act on that information and relieve the Gila County posse. So the Gila County posse finds the camp, figures out they're going to Casa Grande. Meanwhile, Carl Hayden gets the Indians together and they find the tracks. So now that they know that they're going south from Casa Grande, so Carl Hayden wires back to his posse in Maricopa. The Gila County Sheriff is now done. They're like, oh, we're going home for the day. Whatever. You guys have fun. Good luck. So Gila County goes back home. Maricopa County posse now rides south from Maricopa, while Carl Hayden goes back to Maricopa and then grabs the automobile, saying that he'll catch them up because the automobile is faster than the posse would be. So it's this like coordination of little messages that are being sent that are just maybe tens of minutes apart or maybe an hour apart. And just that like very slow but well orchestrated message system.
And looking back, like as you were researching this and listening to the various newspaper accounts, because I don't remember how many different newspapers you researched,
quite
but
a few.
One thing I noticed or didn't notice is what was the actual time frame from the time that they robbed the train till the time they were captured by Hayden and his men?
I think it was it would have been almost 24 hours. It was about a day. So they robbed the train at around 6:45 p.m. on Wednesday night. They spend the night running to Casa Grande. They refill their canteens. I use that in air quotes because they refill their beer bottles in one of the Indian communities near Casa Grande or Zacatón. They then go from Zacatón southwest, or southeast from Zacatón to Casa Grande, from Casa Grande southwest towards Vecal Mine. So they're now running across the desert. The next day, Thursday morning, is when everybody comes into Maricopa and Casa Grande, and they find the camp at daylight of Thursday morning.
Wow.
Carl Hayden goes to Casa Grande in the morning, and by noon or kind of lunchtime, he's in Maricopa getting the automobile and then riding south from there. So from Maricopa to where the boys were found was about 25, 30 miles. So that only took them an hour probably. Maybe a little bit longer because the car kept breaking down.
Yeah.
But it basically was less than 24 hours, probably only 13, 14 hours. From 6:45 at night to 3 p.m., kind of like in the later afternoon the next day.
That's pretty good. I mean, looking at that area, because we did that road trip a couple weeks ago where we went about from Phoenix and actually crossed over the train tracks we crossed the Gila going down to we came up through Levine but we went down towards like about halfway to Maricopa. Yep. And thinking about all of this research and this story and looking at the land. That land is bleak. It is horribly bleak. I mean, the mountain range, I don't know if that was, I guess it was as we were going towards the Estrellas. Yep. So the Estrellas would have been on should have been on their right if they would have been going the right direction. The Estrellas would have been on their right, but would have been farther north. Mm-hmm. There's another couple of mountain ranges that are south of there, and Maricopa is not even close to the Estrellas. So Maricopa is down by it. There's a large peak that separates Maricopa and Casa Grande, and southwest of Maricopa is the Tabletop Mountains. The Tabletop Mountains were where Carl Hayden says that he found the boys. Okay. The Vecal Mine is in the Vecal Mountains, which are just past the Tabletop Mountains. So the geography of Arizona, or at least specifically this portion of Arizona, is the basin and ranges, which means that there's a mountain range, there's a basin, which is a big flat plain, the Valley of the Sun, which is actually a marketing term. The Salt River Valley is between several mountain ranges, and each mountain range defines like the next horizon for the kids. So they were only one horizon distant from Maricopa when they were found. And we did not make it as far as they did. Yeah. We did head west to come home that day, but even in the car and driving 60 some miles an hour towards the Estrellas. I drive faster than that, but yeah. We'll keep it, we don't want to be. Anyways. Plead the fifth. It took forever for the Estrellas to feel big. Yeah. So on those horses. I grew up right in front of those ones, and that's. Yeah. But on our view, as we were going across, thinking in the terms of what these boys were seeing on those horses, it must have felt like they were never going to get to the next mountain range. And they could see the posse coming. Behind them, they could see the dust of the Maricopa County posse. They could see the dust of the automobile coming from a different direction. They could see the dust of all of the Indian community coming after them. Like, they knew they were being followed. They knew they could see it. It's right there. The way that this is all laid out. Because if you've ever been out in the middle of the Arizona desert, you can see forever. And if there's 1,000 people coming across that desert, there's going to be a gigantic plume of dust. Mm-hmm. So the feeling of these boys being thirsty. One of the stories when they got arrested, Oscar was like, "Do you have any water? You're under arrest, son. Do you have any water? Do you have any water? I need water." So he didn't even like acknowledge like, "Oh, these are officers." He was just, "I need water." He drank a gallon when they gave him water. So they were thirsty. They were tired. This is, they've been running all night long. The horses are not happy at this point. They can't keep going. They're being chased by the posse. They see the dust coming. They see the writing on the wall. They are going to die out here. And they're going to be chased down by the posse. So getting arrested by Hayden probably saved their life. Not even probably. Definitely saved their life. Oh, definitely. They would have died out there. Because if there's no water, there's no life. There's no water. It's the desert, man. You don't just run with that water. No. But no, so those were the things that I thought were really interesting, at least to me, was just that they had an idea but they never thought it through. And so, like, you brought up a really good point also talking about, you know, we don't know if they saw the Great Train Robbery, but we did in our research.
Yep. Going
through all of this, reading these stories and these articles.
And I'll link in the show notes the Library of Congress's copy of the Great Train Robbery.
And it was fascinating watching that, having heard all of these articles and all of the explanations of what happened that day, and then watching that movie, and it was almost verbatim.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. And the funny part is they, spoiler alert, end of the Great Train Robbery ended,
which is all of 7 minutes long.
Yeah.
Like, this is a talkie. This isn't even a talkie. I'm sorry. It's a silent movie.
It's crazy music, and the only difference was they took the control of the train at the station versus in the middle of its
instead
run.
Of getting on and then doing something there.
But the whole, like, stashing the horses and moving through it, honest to God, it felt like it was just reading the director notes of the movie.
Yeah, they definitely, I think that they saw the movie. I don't have anything that verifies that, but I think they did. So.
It definitely had that feel to it. And it was fun to finally get to see the Great Train Robbery. I mean, you know.
It's one of the first ones. I was actually in I work in IT, and we were getting a demo of this new 3D presentation software, hardware, actually. So it's like this little cart that has a 3D projector on it, and everybody gets active 3D goggles, and we put them all on. So we've got, 20 people in the room, and we're all looking at just a projector on the wall, but it's 3D. And they're trying to, like, show us that, like, oh, this is for, kids in a classroom who can, you can show them, like, here's a heart, so we can dissect the heart and actually look at all the valves and look at the, everything in there. It's really cool. One of the things that the company chose to demo was this 3D robot that was shooting at the camera. And because it was 3D, everyone was like, whoa, he's shooting right at me. And you could see this, like, the bullet would come at you and fly into your face and everything. The funny thing is, at the end of the Great Train Robbery, Great Train Robbery was part of Bill Williams's, like, Wild West show. At the very end of the Great Train Robbery, there's just a straight on shot of a cowboy looking directly at the camera with a gun, pointing it directly in the face of the camera, and then shooting at the audience. It's the exact same technology demonstrator of, hey, look at this new film media, and whoa, isn't it cool? He's shooting at you. And then this whole thing, 110 years later, they're showing off 3D projectors now in the thing. And the thing that they chose is a robot shooting at the audience. And it was exactly the same thing of, like, everyone in the room was just like, whoa. I burst out laughing because I just watched the Bill Williams one of, like, oh man, that's just precious.
It's funny. It repeats itself.
History repeats itself, definitely.
But yeah, I guess and just looking at the map, like when you were pulling up the old maps of Phoenix in 1910 and seeing where things are today and putting it into that perspective, like where Cityscape is. Yep. And
the Garden Restaurant, which is actually, like, not world famous, was definitely famous in the newspapers of the time. It was Tuck and Hing's Chinese restaurant, which was the Garden City restaurant.
Interesting.
It was actually in a little block of hotels and little restaurants and stuff in there that are all just north of where Cityscape is. So Cityscape has a block downtown. Right on the northern side of that block, across the street, would have been where the Tuck and Hing's Garden Restaurant was. And actually, the Garden City Restaurant was, I think, right after this, was the most expensive retail property that had ever sold to date. It was, the frontage price on that was super expensive because this place was in a perfect location right downtown and was already famous, had a lot of foot traffic right next to it. Researching that was actually pretty interesting, figuring out where 5 Points was. Oh, that makes sense because that's where Grand comes in and hits 7th Avenue and Van Buren. That's like the start of Grand, and that's where the 5 different points come together. Oh, that's the 5 Point neighborhood. Maybe that's a thing that is, like, common knowledge of people that live downtown. I don't know. I didn't know that until just now. But the Cowboy Corral was right next to that.
I think that was pretty interesting because we drive down there quite often from here, and to think, the streets haven't changed that much. Maybe the names.
The names have definitely changed. I found maps of So the numbering system east to west. So the central 7th, whatever. Those used to be Indian tribe names. So it was like Arapaho, Apache, and they would go on and on. Like all of Phoenix for 15 miles, all of the numbered streets had actual names instead of numbers. And at some point, probably after the 1910s, they switched to numbers.
I'm sure when cars became more prevalent and popular, and it was a lot easier to give directions based on avenues and street numbers versus trying to tell someone who's here.
It's very convenient that if like the number street is the one that goes north-south and the name street is the one that goes east-west. It's just easy to do. And I like Phoenix's idea for doing that. And I don't know if it was our idea, but I like that Phoenix implemented that. And the grid system in Phoenix is constantly lauded by people that come here. Like I grew up here. There's the mile streets, the half mile streets, and then blocks. And that's just the way it is. But when I go to other cities, it's like, holy crap, the roads go like all different directions. They have curvy roads over here. I don't even know what curvy roads are for. That's weird, man. Like growing up here, I was kind of spoiled for having like easily navigable streets.
No, I just think the whole idea of Carl Hayden and the Beardless boy bandits.
It's hard to say, isn't it?
It's horribly hard to say,
yeah.
But it's a really interesting story and a great way to start.
I hope so.
I think
it's
so.
Interesting. The next one will probably be the Glanton Massacre. That'll be coming.
Which is also just an interesting story in the fact that there was water. There's water in Arizona that you don't see today.
We see it today in the form of watermelon and corn and all the stuff that we eat that's local to us. But
growing up in a place,
dams and the civilian conservation corps, earthworks and that sort of thing, the dams have reduced the Colorado, the Salt, and the Gila to but a trickle. When they used to be permanent rivers, not so much anymore. But all that water still comes down them. It just goes into our reservoirs. So,
but still, it's just a totally different world than what we see today.
This is true. I starting this project was eye opening. There is so much that I just glossed over. And my dad always tried, like, let's go here, let's read this plaque, let's do history and learn things. And that sucked so much as a child. I hated it. I didn't hate it. It just was boring. But that's the hubris of youth. That's being a kid, is just like, another plaque. I don't want to read the plaque. And now I'm like, well, I'll read the plaque and that's cool. But then I'm going to go home and I'm going to research the hell out of this on on my newspaper search and also a bunch of other things. And like, there's a whole story behind that. Filled full of cool details that inform other things that I didn't even know about, or things that I had heard about but never made the connection that like, this is related to that. Like, I'm starting to see there's a very interesting history. So
definitely. And I like the fact too that you bring up that this story is only one sentence in Wikipedia, where Wikipedia, no offense to the people of
Wikipedia. Using Wikipedia sources.
No. But it's a great jumping off point. I would never use it as actual research, except for that they do a great job resourcing where they find their information.
Show where the sources are most of the time. But it's a good way to jump into a story, to be like, hey, this was really interesting. Now let's learn more. And so you brought up a really good point that here's this one sentence on Wikipedia. In Carl Hayden's biography on Wikipedia, he was amazing. He grew up in Hayden's Ferry. His dad ran the ferry there in Hayden's Ferry, which is Tempe now. And at some point he was elected sheriff. He had an Apperson jackrabbit chase across the desert. And then he went on to this storied career in Congress, and here's 25 pages of like his accomplishments in Congress, which are no slouch. I mean, that's 50 years. On his golden jubilee of Congress, his 50-year anniversary, he was actually like celebrated by JFK. So JFK's first year anniversary in office coincides with Carl Hayden's 50th year in Congress. And JFK makes an actual speech about it, which I'm actually going to play for you here. So I'd really love to include the audio from that in this podcast. However, I do not want to front the fee for using the material. However, it is available for free in the Charlotte Hall Museum audio collection on the Arizona Memory Project. You can find the link in the show notes. You can also search the web for President John F. Kennedy and Senator Carl Hayden at Golden Jubilee. It's a 4-minute MP3 file. In that file, you can hear JFK introducing Senator Carl Hayden, giving a little bit of a speech and making a few jokes. And then you actually get to hear Carl Hayden's voice as he makes a couple of jokes of his own and talks about his 50 years in Congress. So definitely go ahead and check that out. That was Carl Hayden himself in 1961. Okay. 1961. JFK introducing Carl Hayden. He's got to be 86, something around there. He's in his late 80s, early 90s at this point.
That would be about right.
They did the math. So
nice.
It's interesting to see that, like, even back to the point of, this is the Old West, this is the New West. This was a steam train, a gasoline car, a horse chase, an Indian tracker, a sheriff's posse. These are all words that were, the Old West. And then it's, they saw this movie in a vaudeville show and they spent their excess money down at the Chinese restaurant and, like, going to shows with dapper gentlemen and riding the electric trams in Phoenix and that sort of thing. Like, all of those things are super anachronistic, and they could only happen in that time. It could have only happened in 1910. It couldn't have happened 5 to 10 years earlier, because you wouldn't have had cars. You wouldn't have electric trolleys. You wouldn't have any of those things. You wouldn't have the movies. It wouldn't have happened later, because then you wouldn't have the horse chase. It would just be a car chase. It's super interesting. That's like this melding of cultures. And then not only that, but the guy who's completely involved in it is now introduced 50 years later by JFK and actually, like, is still alive and still kicking after a huge, long, illustrious career where everyone loves him. Like, the story is just awesome. It just spans so much time. That's super important to the development of Arizona. And it was during our golden age of development early on.
It was just before statehood.
Yeah, it was 2 years before statehood. 2 years before statehood. It was... Statehood talks started earlier than this. We wanted to be a state in the late 1890s, actually. There was talks about getting us in, but we had problems with that. That'll be another episode with Charlotte Hall. And some of the interesting problems that Arizona brought upon herself because we didn't want to be with New Mexico, and who could blame us? Anyway, that'll be a different episode. But it was just a super interesting time in Arizona, and then also from then on out. Everyone loved Carl Hayden. They even would say in Congress, there was a saying that if Carl Hayden had wanted to vote Arizona, so if Carl Hayden had wanted to vote landlocked Arizona a Navy, Congress would have done it, because Carl Hayden was the third senator from every state. He helped everyone else get their bills passed. He famously had a filibuster that he tried to do on the floor, and then for 20 years after the filibuster, he never spoke again. He never made a speech in Congress for 20 years. But what he would do is he would find people in the courtroom before they go on the floor, or during when they were trying to pass a bill for their state. If he agreed with the thing, he would help them out with it. He would help craft their arguments. He would help give them information that would help them get it passed. He would talk to other senators and try to curry their favor. He worked like under the radar in Congress for a long time, and that's how he became one of the most beloved congressmen of that time. So, and that's what Wikipedia gives so much time on, is his career in Congress, and says, he was in a car chase with an Apperson jackrabbit, and that sentence is actually wrong. It wasn't even an Apperson jackrabbit; it was a Studdard Dayton. At least from what I can tell, that's the so. Yes, I probably won't be using Wikipedia as a primary source.
That's a good thing. But no, I just thought it was kind of interesting that it was one sentence, and yet it was such a loaded sentence that there was such an interesting story behind it.
Yep, and that's how he won his election to Congress. The chase was a huge deal. There were St. Louis newspaper had an article about the Beardless Bandits chase. The Los Angeles Times had it. It became like national news, and that helped him secure a seat in Congress for the newly minted state of Arizona.
So he was the first.
Yep. He was our first representative in Congress. He eventually moved from being a representative into moving to the Senate. So he was in both houses.
That's neat. He did so much and had such an impact on the state on both on a national and a state level and a county level.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess so, because he was the county sheriff as well.
And growing up being a native of...
Well, and Hayden's Ferry was super important to Tempe. Tempe itself was So Tempe was originally in the 1880s and 1890s Hayden's Ferry, and that was because Carl Hayden's father, Charles Hayden, created a ferry there and helped people get across the Salt River, which at that time was flowing permanently. It was hard to get across. So he created a ferry there. He also had numerous other businesses. He had a blacksmith there. He had a flour mill. So he was bringing flour from everybody's farms around there and then milling the flour for them, or getting all the wheat from everybody and milling the flour. The mill that is still there. So in Tempe, Mill Avenue, at the top of Mill Avenue is those like giant silos.
Yes.
Those are, I don't know if those ones specifically are his, but there is a mill there because Hayden had a mill there. So those mills are that. It's Mill Avenue because Hayden's mill. At some point, Tempe split off, and I think mostly the Mexican portion. So the Mexican population of Tempe, or the people that were wanted to keep their Mexican heritage alive, broke off and started the sister city to Tempe on the other side of A Mountain, which actually is called the Hayden's Butte. The actual technical term for that on maps is Hayden's Butte. We know it, well, if you've grown up in Arizona, you know it as A Mountain, which is the one that the Sun Devil Stadium is built into. I had to ask my dad, like, do you know what they actually call that? And he's like, A Mountain. Like, no. Do you know what the actual name is? It's like, Hayden something? I don't know. Like, oh yeah. Locals just know it as A Mountain. We don't even make a difference. So that name has been lost to history. But anyway, Tempe used to be like two separate things. It was cool. I'll cut all that out. I don't know. There's other little stories that came along with all of this. There's the reaction of the passengers. At one point,
I think my favorite reaction is the gentleman who was smart to hold his billfold up, put his hands up, and pitch the billfold out the window.
Yeah.
But no one saw it. But he was able to tell someone exactly where he did it and have them go back and pick it back up.
Yeah, so that was his name, I think it was like Dave Wilkins or something. He was the newspaper salesman. Well, thank you, Karen, for talking about this with me and hopefully adding a little bit to the story and bringing out a little more detail about it.
You're welcome. Thanks for including me. It was really fun to finally put the first episode to bed, as they would say.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get a few more under our belts and then we'll just be rolling at that point.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Karen. All right. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for checking out Arizona history with us. Hopefully you've enjoyed the journey, and we'll be doing a few more episodes in the future. Do we have sign-offs?
I don't know.
Do you just want to go, because you just had the dregs of your cocktail?
Dregs of my cocktail, and I have to sneeze so bad. Perfect. My eyes are watering.
Well, this has been Arizona.FYI with Mark and Karen.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.